Hello and welcome to today's webinar, People Operations, Lessons from Silicon Valley. I'm Ryan Chin and will be today's moderator.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We've structured our webinar today to be a conversation between me and Professor Rao, who most of us refer to as Huggy, as you'll learn. Again, we'd like to suggest any questions that you have, you submit through the form, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So let me begin. So Huggy, can you tell us a little bit about your research and your work on people operations? When and why did you start to study this, and what are some of the key takeaways you might share?
That's a great question, Sarah. Thank you. I think my interest in people operations began when I moved to the Stanford Business School from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University in Chicago. I should, of course, at the very outset, credit my good friend Laszlo Bock for the term people operations. He conceived of it and, of course, institutionalized it in Google. But when I came here, I realized that a number of things that were happening in the Valley, they actually challenged traditional conceptions of what it meant to manage people. Let me give you an example. For instance, most companies say, we love to retain people. Most companies say, we'd love to use our socialization, our boot camps, to indoctrinate people into our culture so that they stay for as long as possible. But on the other hand, in the Valley, all of the engineers, they actually see a new job as a tour of duty. Their view is, I'm going to join a new company, I'm going to be there for 3, maybe 4 years. If I'm not going to get promoted, I'm going to leave. What we began to think about was, how do you actually get people, new recruits, prepared to get promoted? And so what we did was, we actually did a very nice experiment in a high-tech company, and we studied 1,600 new engineers who got recruited, and we used a very simple, lightweight intervention. Everybody who joined the company, in the treatment group, we asked people, hey, write a story of a particular, of a fictional peer, whether he succeeded or not. So there were a number of, the people were assigned into a number of groups. In the control group, we asked people and said, describe what your first year is going to be. They all spoke about their hopes and aspirations. In the treatment condition, we said, your friend Chris in this company has worked for a year. Things haven't worked well. Chris is confused. Help Chris by writing a story of all the things that led to Chris feeling this way. In another treatment condition, we said, your friend Chris has done really well. Chris is feeling elated. Write a story of all the things that led to Chris's feeling of elation at the end of 1 year. So these simple stories, what we discovered was they're called pre-mortems because nothing has happened yet. It's the opposite of a post-mortem. Doing the simple thing which lasted 20 minutes, we found, for example, that it actually improved promotion probabilities significantly. So what's the moral of the research? The moral of the research is you help yourselves when you help others. So that's one example of a research study. Another example of a research study is with our wonderful colleague Lindy Greer and our very bright graduate student Jennifer Daniels. And we were wanting to actually look at what makes startup teams tick. How can you get them to work quicker, faster? And all that we did was we took 85 or so new venture teams. We randomly split them into control and treatment conditions. In the control condition, we asked each of the startup teams, design your own workspace. And in the treatment condition, we asked everybody in each of the teams, come up with a job title that showcases your unique strengths. So the job titles people came up with was the guru of software, the defender of security, like the queen bee of customer service or whatever. And it's amazing. What these job titles did was they immediately activated feelings of accountability. They solved the problem of who knows what in the group. And lo and behold, teams who were asked to come up with their own job titles, they did way better than teams in the control condition. And my question to all the viewers who are so graciously attending this webinar is, do job titles cost you anything? When you ask people to come up with their own job titles, it's a very simple, lightweight thing. So what most of our research looks at is lightweight interventions that actually have big effects on talent outcomes.
Thank you. That is absolutely insightful, and I think I've heard of some of this research as we've talked in the hallways as colleagues, but some of this I haven't heard of, so I can't wait to hear more, not just today, but as we continue chatting about this. It sounds like many of these insights are very much related to this new program that you have developed here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, the People, Culture, and Performance. And I'm wondering if you may just say a quick word or two about what you hope participants in your program will get from the program.
Wonderful. So one of the key things, of course, is, when we put together a program, this is a great occasion for us to innovate. I should add that Sarah actually was my boss, and all that I needed to do was to talk to her for 5 minutes. She gave me the green signal and said, let's go do this new program. That was how fast it was, by the way, just for our viewers. So we do a good idea when I see it. So we do things fairly quickly here. So what's the purpose of the program? As you know, Sarah, so many people come to the Valley and they all want to see the big five. It's sort of like going on a safari to Africa where you want to see like a rhino, a lion, an elephant, and on and on and on, a giraffe and what have you. And here people want to kind of come and see Google or Facebook or Adobe or et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things we sort of thought was, hey, people say culture eats strategy for breakfast. People say talent matters, and nowhere have both of them been so wonderfully manifested as in the Valley. And so what we thought of doing was, wouldn't it be a wonderful idea if we married the clean models from research with, if you will, the dirty hands of practitioners? I call them dirty hands because the practitioners are dealing with very important issues, and sometimes they're ahead of theory. So we need really both of them, and that's really the premise of the program. So the purpose of the program briefly is threefold. In fact, we'd actually urge you to think of it a little bit as a gym, where you work out and develop new muscles rather than sitting in a chair and kind of listening to people, So think of it actually as a gym. And our goal in this gym is to get to hit three objectives. The first is we actually want to inform people about cutting-edge practices. The second thing we'd like to do is to illuminate talent outcomes with evidence-based research, like the two studies I mentioned a little while ago. And the third is we actually want to inspire people to do better. So what are we doing? If you really think of this program, it mixes clean models from research with dirty hands from practice. How do we do that? We do it thematically. We have a couple of themes. One theme is from startup to scale up. What are the tools, tricks, issues involved in talent management from startup to scale up? Another theme is people analytics. A third theme is design thinking. A fourth theme is it's all about teams. So teams are the building blocks of these organizations, and diversity matters. So those are the themes that we're hitting. And the way we do that is we, of course, have faculty from the Stanford Business School. Sarah and I, for example, are in the program, along with a number of our colleagues. We involve people from the Clayman Institute, which does amazing work on diversity on the Stanford campus. They're part of it as well. And we also recruit the Stanford Design School as well. So these are, if you will, clean models, though the design school and the design work that Sarah is also going to be involved in, they kind of are bridges between the clean models and the dirty hands. Now, who is coming from the world of practice? We actually have people from Google, Prasad Sethi, who's going to be in the program, and there's, talking about people analytics at Google, for instance, complemented with Neil Narayani from Uber, saying, when Uber does blitz scaling, what does that mean for people analytics? We also have VCs telling us about how do they go about and hire and recruit people? How do they inspect teams and so on? We'll actually have Adobe coming in and telling you about how did they actually bury performance appraisal. They banished it. They had a funeral for it, if you will. I'm being mischievous here. They came up with something called a check-in. So the other important thing that we want to kind of emphasize is the key to talent is certainly making sure the customer experience and the employee experience, they're powerfully yoked together. We indeed do that, and that's kind of part of what is also happening happening, for instance, at Adobe. I could go on, but hopefully that gives you a flavor of the kinds of things that you can actually expect. And we're very much looking forward to this, Jim, in August.
Wonderful. Terrific. I'm going to mention a question or two that have come in from some of our viewers.
Wonderful.
And one of them, I think you've just alluded to some of the answers for, but I will put this out here. And the question really comes from a public sector perspective. And it's really the question of what institutions or infrastructure have been developed here in Silicon Valley which might support human resources needs of companies. And so I think that some of what you've just said in particular referring to the program, I think has answered that, but perhaps you might want to elaborate on some of this.
That's actually a very good question. You know, when we think of institutional things, often we can think of, like, if you will, government mandated, you know, programs or entities or rules. But the amazing thing about Silicon Valley is a number of private initiatives that take the form of incubators, for example, accelerators, for example. You also have a huge infrastructure in terms of people who actually help you and find and source talent very easily. In addition, there are fascinating public-private partnerships as well. So what you actually have in the Valley is a spectrum of institutions, if you will, or infrastructural arrangements. Some having to do with talent, others having to do with go-to-market, yet another series of things having to do with financing, obviously. All of these are kind of available, and that's indeed what makes Silicon Valley a little bit of a magical place, because you can actually start a company here much faster. And the other thing is there's so much disruption here, you're constantly questioning yourself before congratulating yourself on finding something that's kind of worked. So the important thing is all of those who want to actually disrupt what is sort of happening there, it's important for you to recognize what happens in the guts of companies and how the surrounding infrastructure can actually help build this kind of strength, this kind of competence in your own organizations.
Terrific, terrific. So, Huggy, I've heard you say on more than one occasion, startups have big people. However, the larger the company, the smaller is the person. Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit for our audience about what you mean by this when you say this?
It's a wonderfully mischievous remark, Sarah. I wish I could take credit for it, but it was actually the CEO of a German utility company. He was visiting the Valley, and I asked him, what's the difference between a startup and a large company? And he looked at me, smiled, and said, you know, Professor, startups are small organizations, but the people within them are large. They do many, many things. I said, what about a large company? And he smiled rather ruefully, and he said, well, the larger the company, the smaller the person. Now, it's really interesting when you ask people that, why is it as companies become big, people become smaller? One obvious reason is specialization. We do more specialized jobs. In a startup, jobs aren't as specialized. The other thing is there are many more people, so having an impact is a little harder. Some people sort of suggest politics, but what we found in our research is that the bigger you are as an organization, the easier it is for people to experience a sense of psychological anonymity. And once they feel anonymous, very quickly it undermines accountability. So much of the challenge for our viewers who are presumably in large companies or companies medium to large is, as you're scaling up rapidly, you don't want to lose the mojo of a startup, you don't want to lose the soul of a startup, and you actually have to think of ways in which you can kind of keep that soul alive, you can actually sustain that soul over a longer period of time. So,
nicely said. Good.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Another question has just come in, and I think that this question was probably in relation to what you were talking about when you were talking about the study in which you had people come up with their own job titles, so a non-monetary incentive to attract talent and to keep talent happy. And it presumably also relates to what you were just saying about the differences between startups and larger companies.
Absolutely.
And so the question which has just come in is, what are some of the most effective non-monetary examples of good talent attraction and retention that you found in your research?
Yeah. So That's a really good question. There are a number of things that one can actually think of. And before I sort of begin, the most important thing about monetary incentives that we've all got to be kind of careful about is what they can do is they can crowd out intrinsic motivation. So this is the crowding out kind of hypothesis, if you will. So the sorts of things we have to do in this instance to attract people is to rely on a spectrum of things. So let me give you the range of things that are kind of possible. On the one hand, you can actually start with something as simple as an employee referral program. Now, the important thing there is when you have an employee referral program, it's not that you refer a buddy and you get like some recognition, but it's important that you refer a high performer. So there's actually some kind of constraint there. Now, but the point is, those kinds of schemes, they work beautifully if you're an organization where your goal is to go fast. So you actually want people who know each other, who are reasonably homogeneous, they can work well together and quickly execute. But on the other hand, what if you want to go far? And there, you can't round up the usual suspects. So, you need to actually think of very different kinds of things in order to attract people when you want to go far. Let me give you an example. When you want to go far, one of the most important things is you actually want to recruit people who don't fall in love easily with their hypotheses. And the reason is you're going to be wrong most of the time. You fall in love too quickly with them, you're going to pour a lot of money down a rabbit hole. You can't afford that. So you have to think of new ways of looking for people who are actually willing to update, who are actually willing to change, you're actually willing to do things. And here, what we need to kind of realize is, as we think about people, and indeed what we've learned is, it's not enough merely to understand the voice of current employees or prospective employees. It's very important for us to understand their lives. And only when you understand their lives, you've actually got to think of doing things. So let me give you an example. Recently in one of our classes, I have this amazing speaker called Nancy Lublin. She runs an organization called crisistextline.org. It's a fascinating nonprofit startup. Nancy, of course, conceives of it as a high-tech startup. What's the premise of the business? You actually have young people in distress, often women, who are being attacked, assaulted, molested. They use text to reach out to Crisis Text Line, who pairs them instantly with a counselor, and the idea is to seek a resolution as fast as possible. I was asking Nancy, how do you hire people? And she says, we're growing so fast, we're going to make a lot of mistakes. And I said, how do you find out whether people are willing to make mistakes? She laughed and said, well, let me give you an example. We were hiring a bunch of people. One of them was a hurdler. And I wanted to see, is he concerned about making a fool of himself? Because if you're concerned about making a fool of yourself, you're unlikely to take risks. So I said, how did you test that? She said, in the room, we put a bunch of chairs and we said, you're a hurdler, why do you hurdle over them? And the guy did it. And to us, it was a powerful signal saying, it's okay for me to make a fool of myself in front of these people, and that's the kind of person we want. So hopefully those two examples can give you two bookends. So when you go far, what you need to do is a little different from when you go fast.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, thank you. I'm going to take another question actually from somebody who has asked a question that I'm going to rephrase a little bit as the sort of a question that a lot of organizations grapple with, which is how to best support millennials or younger individuals coming into our companies. And the question really is about how can companies be clear with their rules so that it doesn't leave younger employees eager for promotions.
So, so there's one note to make a distinction between the first promotion and many promotions. The important thing to remember is what many of these employees want is their first promotion, because that's a big signal to them, the organization, and the rest of the world. And often first promotions are harbingers of other promotions. But the point is not necessarily to restrict or contain the aspirations of new employees, it's to actually channel them. Because part of what they're seeing is they're asking themselves, how can I make impact? Now, one visible measure of impact is a promotion, but there are equally other ways in which you can actually give them impact. You could put them on an assignment where they actually have impact on a client's outcomes, for example, on a client's net promoter score, for instance. So those are some of the things that you can do. But when we think of millennials, the question that one of our audience members just posed was a very good one, because what do millennials want? They live in a world of high feedback. They're constantly testing themselves. They're constantly doing things. So their cadence of receiving and asking feedback is very different than a non-millennial employee. You take non-millennial employees, an employee like myself, for instance, what happens? We're accustomed to a cadence of getting feedback once in 3 months, once a year, but you're a millennial, you don't do that. And so we've actually got to replace our old method of doing performance appraisal with something snappier and quicker. In fact, maybe we need to abandon the term feedback, and maybe we need to actually go to a notion of feed forward. Put another way, it's like we don't want people to look through the rear view mirror as they're driving, because many of these companies, they're all driving. We want them to look through the windscreen, and that's why feed forward makes a real difference. And that's why we actually have a very interesting executive from Adobe in the program, Jeff Vayunko, to talk about the pioneering work they've actually kind of done in this regard. By the way, those of you who will attend the program, when you sort of see that, Adobe found out that they spent 90,000 managerial hours on appraisal, and they were asking themselves, what's the value of that? And now they're moving over to 10, 15-minute conversations called check-ins.
That's a great example, and I've actually heard of other companies, not just here
in
Silicon Valley, that are moving towards this, and I think it's a really interesting model and something that I hope you and your colleagues will be able to study as they go forward.
We certainly look forward to that.
Yeah, and on that point, actually, another question that has come in is really about evidence-based management theory and how that's going to fit into, we're going back now to the overall program that you've talked about, but since that one came in, and I think relates certainly to how we might do research as faculty in companies, perhaps you might say a word or two about how that's going to fit into the overall executive program.
Great question, and I'm sure Sarah would join me in echoing this. We're so very fortunate to have two amazing pioneers in the field of evidence-based management here on the Stanford campus. One is our wonderful colleague Jeff Pfeffer, who's actually in the program talking about evidence-based management, and the other is our colleague Bob Sutton, who's been our co-conspirator in many, many contexts as well. So the point about evidence-based management is to actually kind of get this culture of A/B testing into the personnel field and the personnel space. So evidence-based management spans the whole range of things, not just from hiring, not just to compensation, but even as simple a thing as cost cutting. Let me give you an example. I won't be naming companies, but in this company, they needed to do cost cutting. And what did the person in charge of talent do? They quickly said, oh my God, our salespeople in Germany, they all get Mercedes as car leases. So we're going to kind of yank the Mercedes car lease and instead give them VWs. And lo and behold, they'd actually cut costs. Now, this executive is a wonderful guy. He actually did go to Germany, talk to some of the salespeople, and they quickly said, do you know what you've done? And he said, what do you mean? We just took the Mercedes out and we gave you a VW. And these people said, no, not really. It's actually had a big effect on our lives. The most important thing we need, the salespeople told him, was in our job, we need confidence. And what you've done is you've actually struck a blow at that confidence. And he said, how do you mean? He says, well, what do you think? I turn in my Mercedes car lease, I drive home in a VW, my kids look at this smaller car and they say, gee, I wonder what's happened to Dad today. My spouse looks at the new vehicle, she or he is not asking me anything, but they're kind of wondering, is my spouse in trouble? The neighbors look and see, they're kind of downsizing maybe. You don't think all these things are going to affect our confidence? Now, to this executive's credit, he quickly went back and said, oh my God, I needed evidence before I did need to do that. And one of the hallmarks of evidence-based management is every time you have a hypothesis, you need to rule out the null hypotheses. The problem here was there was no null hypothesis. They just said, well, we're going to cut costs, and that was it. This person came back and quickly thought of a very good null hypothesis. What's a good way to cut costs? Reduce perks, harm the confidence of salespeople? Or alternatively, hey, we bought over this company, there are a lot of smokers in the company, I need to launch an anti-smoking campaign. If I do that, my insurance premium are going to go down. Now, that's the kind of thinking we want to foster and cultivate, and that's the spirit of really evidence-based management. Mm-hmm. It's not like reading a book and saying 10 people have done 10 studies and we're going to do that. It's people in companies saying we need to generate hypotheses, test them, and then decide what to do. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I love about how you've just answered that question goes back to something you said a little bit earlier, which I sort of understood as really we need to really understand our people, understand our employees,
right.
and have empathy for them, and
right.
understand what their lives are about.
Right.
And if, in this particular case, in generating hypotheses and null hypotheses, it's really important to have some observation and empathy for the people who work with us. And so I think that that's a terrific insight and draws and comes back to something you said earlier.
Well,
so.
Thank you. You know, I cannot but underscore the point that you just made, Sarah, about lives versus voice. What I see people in companies do is they constantly want to listen to voice, and often this is in an abbreviated summary form. Let's do an engagement survey. Let's do a pulse survey. And believe you me, surveys have their own value. It's not that they are of zero value. I by no means make that claim. The point I'm trying to sort of say is, if you only survey within a narrow domain, you have a sampling bias. But instead, if you understand their lives, you'll think better of what kind of benefits should we give them. You know, what kinds of things do we need to do? You know, so that's kind of what we need to do more of.
That's great. That's terrific. A couple of questions have come in which actually dovetailed with one of the questions that I had planned to ask you. And it's really the question I was going to ask you about is whether or not you could give some examples, some tips on how to keep the soul of a startup alive while the company is beginning to scale. And that was the question that I was going to ask. And one person has suggested something very similar to that. And I'm going to add to that another question that has come in, which I think is quite related. And that is the question of any kind of leading indicators that a company might have as it's beginning to scale, that it's kind of losing grip, if you will, on the culture that that they have as they begin to scale. So I'm putting those together because I see them as quite similar.
Yeah, they're very related. I'm going to kind of oversimplify a little bit because we have the constraints of time and so forth given the webinar. We'd love to share more ideas with you should you choose to come to this wonderful gym in August, but nonetheless. So the key is, how do you sustain felt accountability? And I want all the people in the audience to underscore the word felt. When we think of accountability, we think of 20 key performance indicators. All of you know that the more performance indicators you have, the more opportunity for game playing. I mean, the reason you have 25 performance indicators is presumably they're not all correlated together. Because if they're all correlated, you just need one metric. The reason you have 25, and I'm being mischievous and cynical perhaps here, is you're going to look good on some things, if not everything. So, but it's not the number of metrics, it's actually, do people feel that sense of accountability? And this indeed is the theme of the book that Bob Sutton and I wrote on scaling up excellence, where the point of the book, and indeed the point of sustaining the soul of a startup, is how do you activate this felt accountability? And there are two pillars. One is a sense of psychological ownership. The other is a sense of obligation. If you have 100% psychological ownership, 0% obligation, easy to become egocentric. If it's all obligation, no psychological ownership, it becomes very burdensome. So you sort of have to balance a little bit. So there are lots of things you can do. One example that I already gave was the study using job titles. What are some of the things you can do? Well, you can reduce team size. When you have a team of 5 people as opposed to a team of 20 people, there's no place for people to hide. So when you have an organization with small teams, you got to show up. You can't be a deadbeat. So that's another sort of simple thing to do. Yet another thing to do is actually get customers into the organization. You could even, you could actually have customers attend meetings, because what it says is, whom are you going to be accountable to? Not just to the boss, but presumably the customer who's actually making your paycheck possible, who's presumably making the revenue inflows of the company presumably viable. So those are examples of some things you can do. More generally, there are other things you can do, and we can talk about them. You can create an ownership culture by carefully thinking about the kinds of equity grants one is likely to give. In most companies, large companies that is, usually options and equity grants and the like, they're actually restricted to a large kind of elite. But in the startups here, and scale-ups here, how do you get people to work for you? You've actually got to give them equity, not just when they join the company, equity for performing, equity for being there. So there are other ways in which you can do things. And what I'd urge people to think about is think of them as a spectrum. Lightweight interventions, heavyweight interventions. Equity grants and the like, they're heavyweight interventions. The others are a little bit more lightweight. And my inclination is use as many lightweight interventions as possible, because heavyweight interventions also can constrain you. You need to be way more careful, way more evidence-based before you actually kind of deploy them.
Mm-hmm. Terrific, terrific. I want to actually go back to, you made reference, of course, to the book that you've written with our colleague Bob Sutton, which I have found to be incredibly insightful, and I've used a lot myself. And there's a chapter that you have in there that I particularly like, and this is the chapter that's really about cascading excellence through social networks and bonding. And I was going to ask you if you could talk a little bit about that, and I think it dovetails a little bit with some other questions that have come in that really have to talk about some actions that we can take to improve culture in organizations more generally. And so I think that there have been at least a couple of questions that have come in that refer to culture, and culture particularly in your program.
Right. So again, that's a very good question. I must confess, Sarah, when we spoke about, or when Bob and I wrote this book, we wrote it because we were actually doing an executive program on the one on customer-focused innovation, and people said, how can we take it back and scale it? And both of us gave answers that weren't satisfactory. And so we thought, what should we do? And then we said, well, we need to teach a class to MBAs. By the way, when you don't know anything about a subject, the best way to get up to speed is to teach a course to MBAs. Because when you don't know anything, you're so motivated, the students know that, and you're open, and you want to learn, and you do kind of fun things. So what kinds of things can we do here? So when we started this book, this chapter was actually, the image that Bob and I had was, we'd actually just met somebody who was a participant who had actually come to one of our executive programs. And this person spoke about how during the Iraq war, information about IEDs wasn't actually widely distributed. People, American soldiers, were getting killed on the ground, and one of the sergeants, much to his shock, saw a manual on how to deal with IEDs in an embassy office. And he said, what is it doing here? It ought to be with us. It could have saved lives. Now contrast that with another beautiful experience in Iraq where, as people were throwing Molotov cocktails and the like at Humvees, one of the soldiers said, wow, how do we deal with this problem? We can't build a Humvee that's impervious to Molotov cocktail assaults. Instead, what they did was they actually put these on the sides of the Humvee. They put these, big things on which trampoline-like things on which you jump. So when you have two trampolines on either side of the Humvee, as you're driving, people fling things at you. All that they do is they ricochet off. It's a low-cost way of doing things. And the amazing thing was, within 3 to 4 weeks, if I recall rightly, this Humvee innovation had actually diffused. And so a lot of what we need to do in organizations is we need to connect people, because A, when you're scaling excellence, you're going to make a mistake. Because you're going to try. Scaling excellence doesn't mean just getting bigger, it also means getting better. So every time you try to be better, you're going to make a mistake. The important thing about excellent organizations is they don't make the same mistake twice. So connecting the physiology of the organization, that's why we call it cascading excellence, is very, very important. And again, let's think of simple, lightweight things. Let me give you an example. I had a Stanford alum who works for a private equity company. They had actually not been doing too well. This PE company had bought him over, and he told me their problem was they were all doing interesting things, but there wasn't enough sharing. I said, how are you kind of fixing this problem? Now, he chose to use incentives. What did he do? He called all of his engineers. He put down the top 5 problems the company was facing, and he told them, hey, these are the 5 problems confronting our company. You have a solution, we'll give you a big reward right now if you've solved any of those problems. But then he paused and told all the engineers, however, if you find somebody in the company who's already solved one of these problems, I'll give you 2x the reward. Now, what's he done to the organization? A siloed bureaucracy has become a bazaar, because you kind of figure, am I going to spin my wheels and fix this problem, or find out somebody who's done? What are you going to do? You're going to reach out, you're going to talk to people. So that's a simple way in which you can connect and you can kind of cascade excellence.
Nice. That's terrific. Huggy, there have been a few questions that have come in that I'm going to sort of categorize as questions that refer back to our discussion about millennials. And so, you know, so one of these questions is really about whether or not you would recommend performance management systems that are different for more senior folks than more junior folks. That's one of them. Another is essentially back to what you were talking about with this really terrific term, feed forward. Thinking about if you have any examples of ways in which these could be used to channel young, very ambitious, and sort of competent workers and their aspirations. And the other one is really about the sort of I think claim that many of us have heard that many younger workers are really very much motivated by a sense of purpose and social responsibility, and if you might have some remarks about that. So they're really, all of these questions are about younger workers, motivation, different kinds of performance management.
Those are again very great questions, and I like the way you've sort of connected them, as you will, in the spirit of this chapter into an overall sort of question, Sarah. So the first thing I'd say emphatically is one size doesn't fit all. Absolutely. You really need to have quite different ways of doing, quote, performance management for millennials as, you know, how you do them for middle management and how you do them for senior management. One size doesn't fit all, and you actually have to think of very different ways of doing things. Now, the other thing about the millennials and kind of keeping them motivated and so forth, and you kind of included this wonderful example of corporate social responsibility. You know, take CSR money. I'm always amazed as to why is it the central office ought to allocate the corporate social responsibility budget to organizations such as the United Way, this, that, and the other. Why not decentralize the social responsibility budget? So if you have, let's say, $100, maybe $20 is actually going to be spent by the central office. The remaining 80, you decentralize and give it to your employees and say, hey, each one of you has $1,000 or whatever number it is, or some fraction of this 80% that's actually left. You decentralize it, give people social responsibility budgets, and you actually ask them and say, you choose the socially responsible organization that you want to support in your community. And the big advantage is you're actually sending your millennials a number of messages. One is, we understand you care about this. The second is, we trust you. The third is, you're actually helping us make us much more locally responsive to your community. And to me, the returns you're going to get from that are way better than like advertising on TV or whatever. But again, evidence-based management would be a useful thing here. You can actually check and find out what works best for you, for instance. So again, those are simple ways in which we can do things, but I think understanding top management, divisional management, middle management, and younger millennials, they actually need very, very different things. And we've actually got to think of performance management a little differently. For instance, when you go very high up into the organization, what's the job of a leader? It seems to me the first thing a leader has to do is to be a recruiter. If you can't get people to do things for you, well, that's a real problem. So how are you going to measure that? Now, I haven't come across too many instances where we actually measure people. Now, what can you do to get people to take risks? And the moment we say that and we say, hey, you got to inspire people to take risks, we immediately think, oh my God, the senior executive has to be a charismatic individual. We all know charisma is not normally distributed. There are very few people with charisma. what can you do? Well, and Sarah could tell you a lot more about it, how we can actually use design thinking to reduce the cost of mistakes. Wouldn't that be an interesting thing to do?
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, that will be one of the themes that I will cover when I'm teaching in this program.
Indeed.
I wanted to just riff on something that you said, Huggy, which I thought was really interesting. So a number of years ago, I wrote a case on LinkedIn. So again, thinking about Silicon Valley companies. And one of the things that we found in the writing of that case was essentially what you were talking about with respect to motivating particularly millennial workers. And one of the things that LinkedIn has done extraordinarily well is really come up with a lot of very innovative programs that are very much driven by the millennial workers in that company around social responsibility. And one of the ways that I talk about this in the case is really to talk about how these programs have given the people there autonomy, mastery, and a sense of purpose. Some things that are quite motivating in themselves, and it's been terrific. So,
yeah, that's a great example, you know. So this is exactly the kind of lightweight kind of things.
Absolutely.
And I love the way in which you say the outcomes are not only organizational, but they're also personal. The purpose, the autonomy, and a sense of mastery right on. One other sort of thing about millennials, and we actually hope to cover it in the program, our colleague Paul Oyer, who's a labor economist, is actually going to be talking about what does the gig economy mean for talent and talent management, because in the Valley, not everybody works for you as an employee. A lot of them are contractors. Well, how do you get them to show up on time? In fact, you could ask all of these questions, of course, to our colleague from Uber, who's actually going to share some very, very interesting things that they're doing. One of the important things, again, is what the Valley sort of teaches us is you've really got to kind of marry culture and people to customers and the speed of scaling. A term that people here use, sometimes a little promiscuously, but often usefully, is the idea of blitz scaling. You got to go big, fast. And the reason you need to do that is if you become big quickly, you preempt competition. That sounds like a good strategy, but everything depends upon execution, getting people to do things, and you can't have all of them as your employees. You have to think of like blended workforces and the like. So hopefully those are some of the things we'll kind of channel. An important thing I should point out is that in this gym, you're going to be learning not just from people who the dirty hands folks who are our friends who come from the world of industry where they're at the bleeding edge of practice, as well as researchers from Stanford. You'll also learn from each other. Because the kinds of organizations that have expressed interest and have already enrolled, I'm sure Ryan is going to talk to you a little bit more about that. They're all people with a wide range of experience, and we realize conversation is the oxygen that makes knowledge and insight possible. So plan on having many conversations.
Terrific. Terrific. Actually, with that, it's a wonderful segue to hand this back over to Ryan, who's going to say a little bit more about the program itself, and we'll be back shortly.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you, Professor Rao, and thank you, Professor Sol. From this, the first thing I'm going to do after we finish this webinar is I'm going to go back to my manager and tell him I need to change my title, and then I'm run a test. This webinar is being brought to you by the People, Culture, and Performance Strategies from Silicon Valley program. Throughout this webinar, I think you've heard and know Professor Rao's experience and passion, and he has brought this experience and passion and knowledge to the People program.
Thank you, Ryan. So, Huggy, during Ryan's discussion about some of the parts of the program, a few other questions have come in, and I'm going to put a few of these together, and I'm going to kind of categorize these questions as pain points that people may be experiencing in their organizations now, or perhaps are just curious about or have experienced. And one pain point really is something that we often know about, and that is as companies grow and scale up, one of the things that frequently, although not always, but frequently happens is that we get more layers of management in the organization. And the question really about this is how is this necessary, and has this been happening in your experience in the companies with which you've worked here in the Valley? Is that necessarily happening all the time? Are there ways to avoid it? What are some of the pitfalls, really, of flatter organizations? So that's one of them. Another, another sort of question that I categorize as a pain point is there a good way or some advice that you might have to pitch new ideas to a company that tends to be a little bit less innovative and a little bit more conservative, and in fact sometimes perhaps maybe has people with more closed minds. So I'll put those all together for you as kind of pain points in organizations.
Those are again very interesting questions. I'll kind of address them a little sort of separately. The issue of levels is a very important thing, because one of the things that the Valley teaches us is speed matters. Cadence matters. And there, if you have too many levels, you know, by the time you kind of get approvals and the like and so forth, speed is impaired. Often trust is impaired as well. So you certainly do need to keep the organization flat in terms of hierarchy. However, and this is something our wonderful colleague Anne Raimondi, who's also in the program, is going to talk to you about Zendesk. She's actually going to talk to you about levels, jobs, and ratios and the like. And the interesting thing is, how do you de-link the comp leveling from actually the hierarchical leveling in the organization? So you might want to be a technical person, doesn't mean you're going to be a people manager. So again, one size doesn't fit all. And the point is, we need speed, and we got to do everything to make sure you have speed. On the other hand, people need to perceive growth, so you've got to think of careful ways in signaling those kind of growth opportunities, in part through the way you think of your salary bands and the like, and how they're linked to levels and so forth. So that's sort of one piece. Now, the other sort of thing about what is it we need to do to get organizations to conceive of ideas. And I think one of the questions said, well, perhaps people in my company are a little bit kind of closed. I sympathize with the question and really the spirit of the question, but I'm also going to be a little playful and kind of really pose the question, do we all have one self, or do we have many selves? And it seems to me, when I think of myself, I generally would think of myself as having a person with many selves. So for example, here in California, I'm like very concerned about fitness and you know, being very careful about what I eat and you know, all of these kinds of things. I go to the gym, I have trainers. I go to India, and then my wife says, hey, do you want to go to the gym? And I say, no. And she said, do you want to do yoga? I say, no. And she says, you've changed. I said, no, I haven't changed. The context has changed. It's very easy for me to go to the gym because all I need to do is walk 5 minutes. I'm in the gym, my trainer's there. Now in India, if I need to go to a gym, it's like a 1.5 hour journey, another 1.5 hour journey back, and out of workout, I've lost half a day. Am I going to go to the gym? Probably not. So in a very similar vein, even the people who are conservative, quote unquote, in our own organizations, we ought to actually be open to the possibility they're actually great risk takers in other domains. They might be innovating in the PTA, for instance. They might be very actively involved in doing amazing things in their local church. So I think the thing is, how do we sort of make it easier for them to be kind of innovative and activate that innovative, you know, self, so to speak. And that's kind of the spirit in which we ought to think about. And maybe this interesting challenge is something you ought to actually experience here, working on design thinking with Sarah Soule.
Thank you. Thank you. On that, actually, this is something that I've thought a lot about in terms of how we might use design thinking to better improve our organizations, whether that's motivation of our employees, whether it's culture, whether it's policy or routine. And you know, one of the questions that came in actually quite some time ago, so that I hope that our audience member who asked this question is still with us, but it was a question about what are some gaps that you've seen, even in the Big Five here in Silicon Valley, in terms of attracting and retaining talent? Where are some places for improvement that you might see? The reason I put this with design thinking is that as I teach design thinking and will teach design thinking in your program, Huggy, one of the things that I sort of suggest is using this approach to really understand what the problems are of the people in our organizations and design better solutions.
That's right.
But based on your research and your work with companies here in the Valley, what are some sort of gaps that you've seen?
That there are gaps is certainly undeniable. So let me give you, one of the key things we've learned in scaling, for instance, is when you scale up, the very things that make you successful actually get in the way. So it's like what gets you from 0 to 100, that playbook is not going to work if you're going to go from 100 to 500 and so on. And so what that means is we've actually got to be willing to drop that playbook. But one of the gaps is as organizations grow larger, people fall in love with their tools. How do you get them to give up their tools? You can't mandate an edict. You can't say, I'm going to give you an incentive to drop your tool. And this is where you need to use lightweight kinds of things like design thinking to actually think of how do you actually drop your tools? How do you get rid of things you're kind of already doing? So that's sort of one gap, as it were. Another interesting sort of gap that's there is we get new people routinely into these organizations. We want ideas, but what do you do when they actually come in and become silent and they want to conform? You've hired them because they can help you to innovate and differentiate, and if all that they're doing is conforming, aren't you kind of shooting yourself a little bit in the foot? And so that's kind of another gap area. I could go on, but hopefully these are two kind of gap areas. The big gap, if you ask me, and I'm going to be mischievous to all of our viewers, is, and I'm going to go out on a little bit on a limb, I sort of find that executives in organizations, their pet response or preferred solution to any challenge is incentives. The way I sort of look at it is, it's sort of like thinking, oh God, we got a problem. How do I throw money at the problem? I'm like, wait a minute, is that kind of what you need to do? Maybe you need to think of other things than simply giving people money to do things. Maybe there are better things to do. And this is where I think what design thinking can be very powerful is, it's a great way to organize doubt and discovery. One of the challenges is when you become successful, it's very easy to extinguish doubt. But when you extinguish doubt, the problem is you're not actually questioning about how can you be disrupted and who can disrupt you. You get asleep at the wheel and then somebody steals your lunch. So this is a perennial gap. Many of our audience members, I'm sure, are aware. And a lot of what we need to do with people, culture, and performance is to actually create organizations where you question yourself. In that spirit, and I'm sure Sarah would agree with me as well, is we deeply value your questions, both of us. And indeed, the spirit here is we think of questions as gifts. And that's what large organizations need to do.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So we are just about out of time, Huggy. This has been really informative to me and been a lot of fun for me. And so I'm sure, thank you, and I'm sure our audience as well has really appreciated your wisdom. And again, to echo what Huggy has said, we really appreciate all of the questions that you have sent in for us. We do think of them as gifts. We will try, if we have not gotten to your questions, we will try to respond to those as best as we can by email. Thanks again for attending.